Hello, Digital Dragons, and welcome to another issue of the Dragon Debrief. On this issue of the Dragon Debrief, we will be covering student shoutouts as well as our staff highlights. So let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, we have those student shoutouts, and we are actually doing something a little bit different this year. This year, we decided that we really wanted to shout out a large majority of our students who are really just making a difference each and every week over here at INGDA Middle School. So let's go ahead and get started and recognize these students. So in 6th grade, we have Marley Anderson, Caroline Wilmets, Dominic Kalarchik, sorry about that, Charity Myers, Hunter Fath, Hunter Standifer, Michael Collins, as well as Isaac Williams. Amazing job, 6th grade. And again, I apologize if I had mispronounced your name, but amazing job. In 7th grade, we have Jocelyn Zamaro, Annika Bergens, Jay Newton, Leah Lohorn, Riley Rodacker, Sophia Lane, Mary Campbell Patterson, Alex Barond, as well as Maria Schrewer Rivas. And again, I apologize for that. But amazing job, y'all. 8th grade, we have Kylie Wade, Mason Wisely, Desiree Mayfield, Liam Daughtry, Aliza Bankaren, Enoch Lerdo, Gabriel Rose, Caleb House, Tariana Deanne, as well as Nora Lawson. Again, phenomenal job, y'all. You all are killing it in these first couple weeks, so I do appreciate it, and make sure you keep up the phenomenal work. Amazing job. Next, we are going to jump right into essentially the middle school staff, and I always like to do this at the very beginning of the year just to kind of give all of our parents and students a heads up on who exactly is who, as well as what role they have over here at INGDA Middle School. So first and foremost, we have Mr. Payne, which is myself, and I am the middle school principal over here at good old Indiana Gateway Digital Academy, home of the Digital Dragons. We also have Mr. Sinicki, who is actually our special programs administrator. We have Mrs. Dion, who is one of our instructional coaches, as well as our 8th grade science teacher. We have Mrs. Schmidt, who is actually our lead counselor over here and also takes care of all the counseling needs for our 8th graders. We have Mrs. Clifton, who is also another one of our instructional coaches, but is also a 6th grade ELA teacher as well. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Andrus, who is our 6th and 7th grade counselor. So that is your admin team over here at the middle school. Next, we have our English department. And as always, we have Mrs. Clifton, who I just introduced a second ago. And again, she is does halftime instructional coaching, the other halftime 6th grade English. We also have Becca Anderson, who is one of our 7th grade English teachers. New this year, we actually have Mrs. Morris, who right now is doing a split between 6th and 7th grade English. However, we are currently in the hiring process and getting ready to add another English teacher to our department. So she will actually be moving to either just 6th or 7th grade. We also have Mrs. Pettit, who is our 8th grade English teacher, and then Mrs. Harrison, who is also our 8th grade English teacher. Next, moving on to our math department, we have good old Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore is our 6th grade math teacher over here at INGDA. We also have Mrs. Besser, who was our 7th grade math teacher over here. And then new this year, we actually do have Mrs. Edmondson, who right now is also doing a split between 6th and 7th grade math. And not listed, we actually just hired Mrs. Poffenbaugh, who will actually be joining us here in a couple weeks, and she will be taking on the role of either 6th or 7th grade math. We also have Mrs. Sanders, who is our 8th grade math teacher, as well as Mrs. Mays, who is also our 8th grade math teacher. So awesome. Next, we have our science department. And first and foremost, we have Mr. Hartshorn. Mr. Hartshorn is actually our 6th grade science teacher. We then have Mr. Rice, who is our 7th grade science teacher. And we actually just recently hired 2 science teachers who also should be starting here in the next 2 weeks. Excuse me. And those are Mrs. Garofano, who will either be joining us as a Science 6 or Science 7 teacher, as well as Mrs. Whalen, who will also be taking on that additional science teaching role. Next, we have Mrs. Dion, who again is also half-time instructional coach, half-time Science 8. And then we have Mrs. Springer, who is our other Science 8th grade teacher as well. Moving on to our social studies department, we have Mrs. Ryder, who is your 6th grade social studies teacher. We have Mrs. Barr, who is your 7th grade social studies teacher. And we actually just hired Mrs. Clark, who again will be starting with us here in about 2 weeks or so. And she will be taking on a split between 6th and 7th grade here in the social studies department. Next, excuse me. Next, we have Mr. Logan, who is one of our 8th grade social studies teacher. And then Mr. Ruanto, who is currently a mix between 7th and 8th grade social studies, but he will be moving up to just solely 8th grade after Mrs. Clark joins us. So awesome, awesome job. Next, we have our electives department. First and foremost, we have Mr. Ponson. Mr. Ponson is actually one of our CTE teachers over here at the middle school. We have Mrs. Spangler, who is our art teacher. We then have Mr. Wagaman, who is actually a mix between our careers teacher as well as 7th grade PE. We have Mrs. Powell, who does a mixture of both PE as well as health. And then we also have Mrs. Theobald, who was our Spanish teacher over here at the middle school. Lastly, we have our special programs department. So first off, we have Mrs. Pedigo Plummer, who is actually our lead special programs teacher. We have Mrs. Kinsley, who is our 6th grade special programs teacher. Oh, and we also have Mrs. Dubé. Mrs. Dubé actually just moved into the role of the assistant principal for the special programs department. So awesome, awesome, awesome. We have Mrs. LaRue, who was one of our 8th grade special programs teacher. And then Mrs. Lulin, who is actually one of our 7th grade special programs teachers. Then we also have Mrs. Hensley. We have Mrs. Evans, Mrs. Jackson, as well as Mrs. Caruso. So awesome, awesome, awesome. And last but not least, we have some of our paraprofessionals over here. We have Mrs. Boss as well as Mrs. Brigham Lampley. So again, thank you very much. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I will be attaching this PowerPoint to the email that I sent out just in case you needed any of these teachers' content.